I feel fortunate that I have actually personal experience with the three speakers here from a wellness standpoint. Lauri Glenn has helped keep me moving through my 40s, I think is a pretty fair way to put it. And Lauri has been a wellness practitioner for 25 years. Again, I'm not going to read the bio, but she's a yoga and meditation wellness coach, Reiki teacher, and body worker. She's a visionary and a contributor to the Future Truckee River Wellness Collective. And I'm really grateful to have you here and to move things along. You can just hit this little button there.
Technology magic, I love it. Thank you for the introduction, Jan, and thank you to all of you for coming. This is really an honor to be here, and it's my pleasure to speak. So I'm going to attempt in 10 minutes to sum up one of the most important discoveries in neuroscience in the last 20 years. So take a breath. All right, so I want to start today with some questions for you. So by a show of hands, please, how many of you experience anxiety or depression or just general overwhelm with life or the world sometimes? Take a look around. How many of you feel like you have a super busy mind, you get distracted easily, or you have a hard time focusing? Yeah, a little bit of this. And how many of you find yourself just reacting without even thinking about it out of maybe anger or fear or blame or judgment? You can close your eyes if you don't want to be seen. Raise your hand. All right. So if you looked around, you can see you're not alone. This is really our world right now. So my next question to you is, how many of you know somebody who's just always calm and super present when you speak to them and just kind of walks through life with grace and ease and wisdom? Do you know somebody like that? Yay. How many of you would like to be a little more like that? Yeah, okay, me too. So up until about 20 years ago, it was a well agreed upon fact that the human brain stopped changing and evolving around the age of 20 to 22 years old. And you were pretty much just stuck with who you are and how you were, essentially your traits, your personality traits. But science being what it is, which is a continued investigation into the known and unknown, has discovered in the last 20 years that actually that's fake news. Our brains do grow, they do change, and they do evolve throughout the entirety of our adult lives. And we can affect change specifically. So it's called neuroplasticity. So neuro refers to the entire distributed nervous system. So Dr. Wieland talked about the brain. It's the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves. We're just going to call it brain for simplicity. Plasticity refers to this quality of being moldable or changeable. So neuroplasticity changes the brain, literally structurally, the shape of the brain in three really specific ways. One way is it creates new neurons. So these are the nerve cells that makes your brain do brain things. We can create new synapses, or the connections between the nerves. This is how they talk to each other. We can also create new myelin. Myelin is the sheath that covers the nerve, and it's responsible for the speed of transmission of communication. So literally, through neuroplasticity, we can create bigger, better, faster brains. Cool, yeah? So, how does this work? So neural pathways. Every single thought, every word, every feeling, and every action that you engage in either creates a new neural pathway, nerves talking to each other, or reinforces and strengthens an existing one. So the more you do a thing, the stronger and faster these connections get. This is how habits are created, right? Some habits are super awesome, like how to feed yourself, how to drive your car. We don't want to have to think about those things. Some habits are not really skillful, like blowing up in anger every time something doesn't go your way and blaming somebody else. So, awesome. So how do we get more calm and compassionate and graceful and all these things that we talked about, that person that we knew? Neuroplasticity affects pretty much all of the brain, but one specific area that I want to talk about today, don't need that slide, is the prefrontal cortex. Has anybody heard of the prefrontal cortex? Yeah, okay. So this is the most evolved part of our brain. It's literally at the front of your brain. It's the part of our brain that differentiates humans from animals. It's responsible for executive, higher level functioning. So it's a pretty important part of the brain. And I want to talk about the 9 main functions that the prefrontal cortex has. We're not going to talk about all of them for time's sake, but there's some really important ones here. So the first one here is empathy. This is our capacity to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and understand how they might feel, how they might be experiencing a situation. This is super important. Number 3 and 4, response flexibility. This is probably the most important one in my mind. This is our capacity to stop, to pause in a situation and reflect on the entirety of the situation before we choose to engage in any way or not engage. So being able to pause is super important. This ties right into emotional regulation. This is our ability, the brain's ability to regulate our emotions from the super, super high highs and the super, super low lows so that we're operating from this steady ground when we choose to respond. So we're going to skip all the way down to number 9, fear modulation. If anybody pays attention to anything in the world right now, there's a whole lot of fear being thrown around, getting us to engage in particular ways. So this is the part of our brain that allows us to modify our response to fear or extinguish it altogether. And it talks and it connects directly to what Dr. Velan was speaking to, the amygdala, the hippocampus, these things that are related to our fight or flight response. So through neuroplasticity, we can make these bigger, better, faster. They can function better. They're higher functioning. So how do we access neuroplasticity? Because this all sounds great. The scientific community is agreed upon and has demonstrated through years and years of studies, which continue to grow, that mindfulness meditation is an unbelievably powerful harnesser of neuroplasticity. This is from Dr. Dan Siegel. Check him out. He's amazing. So that's what I'm here to talk about. So mindfulness practices. What are mindfulness practices? What is mindfulness meditation? It's intentionally, on purpose, directing your attention in a very specific way for extended periods of time in order to cultivate a state of mindfulness. All right? So within those practices, there's general practices that cultivate general states like presence, non-reactivity, non-judgment. There's also really specific mindfulness practices that cultivate really specific states, things like compassion and generosity, forgiveness and joy. So all things that we probably could use a little more of and that the world could. So how does it work with neuroplasticity? Through the mindfulness practices, we cultivate the state of mindfulness that I just talked about. Through repeated activation of these states, we fire neurons in the brain, the nerve cells, that trigger neuroplasticity, the actual structural changes. And with repeated activation of this, through neuroplasticity, we turn the state into a trait. So we're literally changing the brain into these states of consciousness. So, what about yoga? So we're tying yoga into all this. So really simply, yoga is a system that has 8 limbs or 8 facets to it. The first 4 address things like ethics, breath, movement, and they do it in a really mindful way. The last 4, the other half of yoga, specifically addresses mindfulness meditation practices. So, same concept. Through the yoga practices, we cultivate a state of consciousness essentially. Through the repeated activation of that state, we fire neurons, we trigger structural changes in the brain called neuroplasticity, and when we continue to do that, we change those states literally into a trait of our being. Does this all make sense so far? Okay. So, sounds awesome theoretically, right? Super simple. We just do these things and then we change our brains. It is, really, but it's not a quick fix. It's not a surgery. It's not a pill. It's not an injection. It doesn't work in a day. It takes time. It takes effort, just like anything worth doing. So it really takes a dedicated practice and a willingness, and this is important, that you want to do it, not somebody else wants you to do it, regularly. This is frequently and consistently. So it really does require you to make effort. But the good news is, in just 5 minutes a day, you can make a difference. Thanks. Within days to weeks, you can feel calmer, more steady, maybe a little less reactive. And all of the studies show that at 8 weeks, this is when the neuroplastic changes start to happen. You are literally reshaping your brain into a different way of functioning. So just think about, consider, over a lifetime of continued dedicated practice, the potential for positive growth and change. I mean, it's outrageous. It's really magic. So the idea that we're stuck is really just fake news, folks. We have the brain, we have the tools, we have the choice, and it's our responsibility. We can change. So I'd like to end with Dr. Dan Siegel's words. He says, all of us on this planet can awaken our minds and focus our attention in a new way to not just transform our individual well-being, but our collective path as a species.